Have you ever created your own custom key binding or tried to use one that's documented in a package or in Sublime only to discover that it doesn't actually work for you and you don't know why? There are a few different reasons why that might be the case. So in today's video, let's show you how you can diagnose your key binding problems. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on diagnosing key binding problems in Sublime Text 3. Before we get to that, though, if you're finding the videos on the channel in any way useful, helpful, informative, if you'd like to be informed when new videos become available, then you can use those buttons down below the video to subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. If you have any questions, comments, or requests for clarification on this video or any of the videos, or you have a suggestion for a Sublime Text topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, you can leave those down in the comment section below this video, or you can also hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd as well. Now, as we said, the content of this video is all about figuring out why our key bindings aren't working. And there's a few different reasons and ways that this could go wrong. You could press a key expecting something to happen and nothing happens at all. Or you could press a key expecting something to happen and have something wildly different happen instead. And as we'll see in today's video, we're going to give you some tools you can use to try and dial in and figure out exactly what's wrong there. And the main way to do this is by using the Sublime Text console, as we covered in the previous video. So, if you go to the View menu, there's an item named Show Console. You can also use the key binding, which is what we'll be doing for the remainder of the video, which is Control Backtick, and that's the same across Windows, macOS, and Linux. Choosing that opens this console at the bottom of the window. Now, as we saw in the previous video on figuring out what commands you might want to use in your key bindings, if you were to type sublime.log commands true, like so. Now command logging is enabled and will remain enabled until we restart Sublime or use sublime.log commands false down there in the console. And anytime we press a key that executes a command or choose a menu item that executes a command, it will be logged here. What this doesn't log, as we covered in the previous video, is items in the command palette. It used to, it doesn't any longer. We don't know what the reason for that is or if it'll come back. But if you want to know what commands you're executing from the command palette, see the previous video on how to figure out what commands you want to use in your key bindings. I show you a way to figure that very thing out by looking at the package resources. But we could see, for example, if I push the key binding for opening the command palette, that is show overlay, we can see down there, and it's just showing us the argument to that command as well. So I'm going to close that and click back to give the focus back to the console, which we can see executes the drag select command. You'll see that anytime you click your mouse while command logging is turned on. Another thing that we can do here, which is going to be really helpful to us coming up and figuring out exactly what's going wrong, is by doing something very similar. We could type sublime.log input true, like so. Input logging works the same as command logging. And now that I've done that, input logging is turned on. It will remain turned on until I turn it off by using log input false or restart Sublime. And what logging input does is to provide input in the console about keys that you're pressing. And this goes in a couple of different ways. For one, if I was to use the key for opening the command palette, we can see the console now logs two things: a key event for Shift Control P, because that's the key that I pressed, and then the command that was executed as the result of that key press. And if I was to type something without adding a modifier to it, like control, like say I pushed the P key, we can see that gives us a character event of a lowercase p, because that's what that key represents as a character. Similarly, if I hold down Shift and do it, we get an uppercase P. And this also applies in various other ways as well. For example, if I was to hold down the Windows key on this keyboard and also Shift at the same time and press H, we see two things happen. There's two key events. There's Super Shift H, that's the key that I pressed. Because nothing is handling that key event, it gets passed back to the operating system. The operating system says, hey, someone pressed Shift H, and we get that character as well. This isn't as common as all that, but I'm just doing that to point out that you see character events, you see key events. In certain situations, you may see key events followed by character events. That's an indication that the key event was something that wasn't directly handled. So with this information under our belts, let's go ahead and dive into the various ways your key bindings could go wrong and how you can figure out why and fix the problem. So let's say we wanted to create our own custom key binding for the purposes of this example to toggle comments. And we would create our own custom key bindings, of course, by going to Preferences, Key Bindings in the menu or via the command palette. That opens a window that we can maximize. And on the left are the default key bindings for our platform. And on the right are user customized key bindings. And we can see here I've added a key binding for toggle comment to the key super.c, and on Windows, super is the Windows key. This is the same command that is bound to the control / key on Windows, and I got that by looking in that default key binding on the left. And so as a result of that, I should be able to hold down the super key and press C and toggle comment on this. So let's see what happens. I push the key and I'm pushing it and nothing is happening. But if I was to use the official key for that, control / we see comments working. So the command works, but this key doesn't. What might be the reason for that? So what we would do is jump to the console where we can type sublime.log commands true, like so. And then we can go ahead and come back to the file that we are working on here. And if I hold down super and press C, I don't see anything being logged. So it doesn't seem to be running that command. And again, if I push the key that I know it's bound to, we see it's running toggle command block false. So that's definitely the right command, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything when I press the key. So the next thing we would do again is come back to the console and type sublime.log input true, like so. And now input logging is turned on. So now if we were to again to come back up to here, if I use the key binding that I know works, we see control / and executing the command toggle command comment. So that's working. And if I hold down the super key and press C, I'm not getting any input logged either. And this is one of the main reasons why your key binding might go wrong. And that is using keys that something outside of Sublime are already using. And there's a variety of ways that this could happen. And it can happen on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. The more obvious reasons for this are the keys are bound by the operating system itself, or in the case of Linux, whatever window manager that you're using. Because when it comes right down to it, Sublime can't react to a key press if the operating system doesn't tell it that a key was actually pressed. Now, in this particular case on Windows, most key bindings that use the Windows key are actually reserved for Windows's use. So even though I'm pressing that key, Windows is just doing nothing in the background. Depending on the key you're using and the operating system you're using, you may find something completely outside of the context of Sublime happens. For example, if I hold down the Windows key and press V, we get this clipboard pop-up thing, which is something that Windows generates on its own. So that's an example of Windows is using that key. It didn't get logged in the console. As we can see, I can't bind something to that key. And the keys that are here will vary depending on the operating system you're using and the version of that operating system. So this wasn't the case in Windows 7, for example, but now in Windows 10 it is. And similarly, across different versions of Mac OS, the key bindings you use to move virtual desktops or windows left and right or go into mission control will change depending on things. On Linux, different window managers might use different key bindings to raise and lower windows, give them the keyboard focus, things of that matter. And even outside of that, it's possible for external applications to have a global keyboard shortcut defined. For example, device managers for video cards have been known to have that sort of action to be able to toggle settings back and forth between different things, or auto hotkey on Windows, or if you're creating screencasts such as myself, there's a global key binding on the thing that stops the screen from recording. Sublime wouldn't get that as well. So the first thing to try, if you try to type something and try to execute a key binding and nothing happens, is turn on input logging to see if Sublime can even see the key that you're pressing. And if it can't, you can't bind that key unless you can release that key. Now, in some cases, you can go into your operating system or your window manager and remap keys to make them available for Sublime. In some cases, that might not be possible. You may not be able to figure out what external application is doing this and blocking the key. In that case, you just have to choose another key that will work. Here we have a couple more examples of ways your key bindings could potentially go wrong. So here we have a sample file, and as we can tell from the indicators in the gutter for the incremental diff, I've deleted some lines from the first paragraph, I've added some lines to the second paragraph, and I've modified a line in the third paragraph. And if I was to select this paragraph, I should be able to use the revert command, which on Windows is bound to the key Control-K, Control-Z to revert this change. And if you're unfamiliar with that key binding or this whole functionality in general, there should be a card up there at the top of the video. I did a video on this a couple of weeks ago. It's a feature that was added to Sublime Text version 3.2 in build 3200. But if I push that key, Control-K, Control-Z, I would expect that change to revert, but it seems to do nothing at all. And over here in this tab, we have a sample HTML file, and one of the features of Sublime is auto-closing tags. So you might expect that pushing slash should close this paragraph tag, but in fact, it doesn't have any effect at all. And I have to do that manually. And what's the problem with that? So as we might expect, the ways to investigate this would be to go to the console and type sublime.log commands true. Like so. So we can see what's actually being logged when we, or what command is actually being executed when we press a key. And we could also even go ahead in this case and do log input true as well, like so. So we can see what keys we're pressing to make sure that we're actually pressing what we think we're pressing. So in this case, I'm going to press Control-K, Control-Z, and we see the console printing that, but it's executing something called zoom panel instead. That doesn't sound like it's going to revert a change. And similarly, over here, I might push the slash key like so, and we see the character event for that, but no command is triggering. So Sublime's getting the input, but it doesn't think there's anything special about it. And there are in fact each of these things is two different reasons why your keys may not do what you think they do. The first here in this case is that, as we can see, the command that's being executed is zoom pane. That's not anything to do with reverting. And if you watch that video where we talk about incremental diff, this is actually the origami package that is doing this. Now, it should be our hint that this command doesn't have a name that looks like it does what we think it is, that there's an issue with the key binding. So in that case, what you need to do is figure out what the default key binding was and then apply it. And to do that, you need to know where the default key binding that you want came from. In this case, this is functionality that ships with Sublime, so that's just the standard key bindings. If there was a problem with a package's key binding, you need to look in that package's key binding. So for example, we could go to Preferences, Key Bindings like so, expand the window, and we want to give the pane on the left the input focus. And now we need to search in here for the key that we are looking for. And it's Control-K, Control-Z. So we might type Control plus Z in order to find that. And here we can see that's the undo key. And here's Control-K, Control-Z to a command called revert modification. That sounds more like the thing that you would expect. And so this is the key binding that we want. So what we could actually do in this case is copy that and jump over to the right-hand side here and paste that binding in to return back to the default. And when we come back to our original file, now when I push Control-K, Control-Z, it's logging the correct keys, it's running revert modification, and that has been reverted from alpha back to beta, so that change has worked. And similarly, if I was to do this and one more time, now the file is back to the state it was before I made those modifications. Those deletions have been added back and those additions have been removed. Now, when it comes to this one's actually more obvious because this should be an HTML file, but as we can see from the name on the tab and the syntax in the bottom right of the window, this is actually a plain text file. So anything that you expect to work in an HTML file probably isn't going to work in a plain text file because it's, plain text. But in this particular case, what do we know? We know that when we press the slash key, we expect this tag to close. So what we could do is again decide what package is providing that functionality. And in this case, that's default functionality that ships with Sublime. So that would be the default key binding. So again, we'll come back to here, give the focus to the bindings on the left, and search for the key that we're interested in, which is this key. And there may be a few of these for you to search, because this appears a lot. So in that case, you might want to search for something like this, because if you're pressing just the slash key, then that is probably just wrapped in a string like so. And now we can see there is actually a binding here. And in order to see this, I'm going to make this pane a little wider. And here is a command bound to the / key called close tag, which seems to indicate that that is the command that we want. Now, this key binding has a context in it. That's a big topic. That's not something we're going to cover in this video. That's a topic for a future video. But in general, if a key has a context, it's saying that it only applies in key specific times and places. And as we can see here, there's 3 reasons why this command might not be working. Going from the bottom up, the auto close tag setting has to be turned on. In this case, I know that it definitely is. The next one up is the text prior to the cursor needs to be it needs to be a less than sign, so that we know that we're definitely typing a close tag. And in this case, we know that's definitely the case. And the very first item in here is this key binding only applies when this is an HTML file or a text, an XML file, and not inside a string or a comment. Now, if you don't know how scopes and scope matching works, there's also a video on that on the channel, because it's a pretty big topic. Again, we're not going to cover it here. The general gist of this is that's the line that indicates that this only works in an HTML file or an XML file, but this isn't an XML file, so our supposition is borne out. And if we were to come to the console and type syntax HTML like so, and of course you could also click on the syntax in the bottom right of the window, this is now HTML. It's automatically syntax highlighted. As soon as I press slash, boom, the tag is closed. The console says close tag. So in both of these cases, we need to be able to figure out what package is actually defining the key so we can further investigate. And if it's a case of a key that exists in only a specific circumstance, you need to make sure that that circumstance is in effect. And if it's the case of the key binding in a package looks still correct, but it's not what's happening, then another package somewhere along the line is overriding that key binding and changing it. So in that case, you would take that key binding and put it into your user key bindings, because your user key bindings are the final arbiter of what is considered to be a key binding, and it trumps and overrides everything else. Another way that your key bindings can go wrong has to do with keyboard layout problems. And primarily this affects people that are using keyboard layouts for other languages in other parts of the world than North America. Say, for example, a Russian keyboard layout, or a Spanish keyboard layout, or a French keyboard layout, and things of that nature. And to some degree, this can also be the case for UK keyboard layouts as well. And in those other keyboard layouts, keys may not be in the same position as they are on a US keyboard layout that some of us may be more familiar with if we're from North America. And those sorts of keyboards can also have the idea of dead keys, where in order to type a letter with an appropriate accent on it, you have to type multiple key inputs to be able to trigger that. So sometimes some keys don't work on their own and require you to press other keys. Now, this usually manifests as a problem where you press a key, but Sublime's not seeing it as the key that you expect it to be. And to a large degree, that has to do with the underlying nature of keyboards and how they work in hardware, and the fact that Sublime is reading the keyboard at a low enough level when it gets keyboard events that it sort of makes assumptions about what the keyboard layout is, so things may not line up. And in order to demonstrate that, what we're going to have to do here, what I'm going to do, because I don't speak languages other than English, is switch over to this Dvorak keyboard layout, which means that if I were, for example, to type the QWERTY part of the keyboard, QWERTY, we see that is not at all the keys that appear up there. So let's say that I actually wanted to open the command palette here. I'd press Shift Command P, and nothing happens in that particular case. And in order to figure that out, I'd have to turn on keyboard logging. So what I'm going to do in this particular case, because I'm not going to be able to type otherwise, is switch back to the keyboard layout that I'm used to. Now I'm going to come down here and I'm going to type sublime.log input true, like so. And you could, of course, also do this with command logging as well as a part of your investigation. But in this particular example, we know exactly why it's going wrong. And I'm going to switch the keyboard layout back to something that's not what one might expect. And I'm going to press the key for opening the command palette. And the key binding I get is Shift Control L instead, because on a Dvorak keyboard layout, the P key is actually the L key. Now, this example is quite contrived in this case because presumably if I actually had a Dvorak keyboard and that was the layout that I was using, the keycaps would actually line up, and when I tried to push P, I'd hit the right one. But this, as I said, also happens because there are some keys that are just in different positions on US keyboards versus other keyboards where the key bindings don't quite line up the way you might expect. And an example of that is the shift state of keys. For example, on a US keyboard, the pound sign or the hash key is the shift state of the 3, but that's not the case in all of the key layouts that exist out there. Those might exist on as the shift state on other keys or be their own dedicated keys instead. And in that case, if you try to put a binding on the Control 3 key, expecting that to have a particular item, it might not work the way that you expect it to. In this particular case, the thing to do would be to go into your key bindings and override the bindings from what Sublime thinks they are to what your keyboard thinks they are. As of right now, there's no easy way to just transfer all of the key bindings from one language to another. You could check the internet because there could be other users of your language that have gone to that effort. But this is, I'd say, one of the less common problems with key bindings, but it does definitely exist. So if you're not a native English speaker or a native English writer, this could very well be your problem. So there we have just a few of the more common reasons why your key bindings might not be working the way you expect them to. But with a little judicious logging of input and commands, as we've seen in the video, you can figure out what it is that Sublime thinks you're doing and is trying to do, and compare that against what you thought it should do, and that can help you figure out exactly where things are going wrong. So I hope you've found this helpful and informative, and if you'd like to see other informative videos like this, please use those buttons down below to subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And of course, if you have any questions or comments on this, or requests for clarification, or suggestions for other topics you'd like me to cover in a future video, you can leave those down in the comment section below. You can also hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. That's all I have for this video. Until the next one, this is ODATNerd asking you to please have a sublime day.